OG Rose, and today we're going to talk about a paper called On Principles. Is what seems to be ethical only ethical when arrived at during versus brought into? The paper is going to be reflecting on the meaning of the term principles. What are we getting at when we talk about principles? That we are principled people, that we have principles that cannot be violated. Certainly there is a positive form of this term, as there's a positive term of, say, love. There's a paper on love. And there's this method we try to use in these papers where we go by all the possible meanings of the term, like love, to try to get an isolated understanding of what the word could be referring to. Because if we can't say meaningfully define like from love, or loving and being nice, well, then a question arises on why we even use the term love at all. If all love is a term that's a simile for like, then why not say like? And in fact, just using like may avoid confusion, because we would cease to be confused into believing that a phenomenon exists called love when it really does not. And so likewise, in this work, it's just examining the term principles. Does principles mean morals? Well, often like ethics or morals are things like laws that you should follow, or dispositions, or the fitting way to carry oneself in a situation. But it doesn't really seem to be principles. Principles seem to be something more epistemological than it is ethical. Now, people certainly use principles in a kind of ethical sense, because it's as if the term means this is the right epistemology to use in this situation. Therefore, it is ethical to use in this situation. So it seems to have something to do with ethics, but it's also not the same as, say, an ethical action, say, avoiding a lie or treating someone kindly. Am I acting principled when I treat someone kindly, or am I acting moral? Well, it would seem to be that I'm just acting moral. Principle seems to be something epistemological, a way of thinking, a mode of thinking. Well, does principle mean preference? Like, my principle is X, therefore my preference is X. If so, then one must wonder if principle is a dangerous term, because it might just be a way to moralize a preference. And that could be sneaking in just something that's selfish, as if it is something universal and non-contingent. Well, that's something we're going to have to keep our eye on. The next part is going to ask, are principles ways of thinking or guidelines? Now, I'm a big fan of mental models, of thinking about having different ways of thinking about problems relative to what those problems are. You know, you could reference Charlie Munger, you could reference Ray Dalio. All of them have a real strong understanding that you need mental models. But if principles are simply mental models, why not talk about mental models? Why do we need the term principles? And often when people talk, it doesn't seem to be the case that principles as mental models is what they mean. Again, it seems to be something like a conviction. Like, my principle is X. So it doesn't seem to mean guidelines or mental models, even though perhaps it could be used in that way. Well, what about like defaults? Does it refer to my default positions when I walk into a conversation? Now, I like Thomas Nagel's book, The View from Nowhere, where he talks about that it's impossible to have a view from nowhere. So we always have to bring into conversations defaults or certain starting positions. So is that what a principle is? A starting position? Well, that seems to be closer to the truth. So principles have something to do with defaults, places from which we start. And it doesn't really seem to be useful if we're using it as a simile for like laws or ethics or things like that. Also, it doesn't seem useful to use the term principle to refer to a generality. Like if I say my principle is X, it's my principle that a man should always open a door for a woman, or that a man should work, something like that. It doesn't seem to be a generality, even though there's a sense in which it would be applied generally, because you have an idea that everyone should do this, non-contingently. And yet, it doesn't seem to be the same as a generality, because it seems fair to say that generally people like to be outside when it's 70 degrees outside versus when it's 40 degrees outside. Well, that kind of generality just seems to be based on observation. You're not saying everyone likes to be outside when it's 70 degrees, but it's a fair bet that more people will be outside when it's 70 than when it's 40, right? But is that really a principle? A generality seems to be an assessment based on an observed pattern, like something that arises. It's a good bet, right? It seems similar to a principle because there's something about a principle that you carry into many situations, or that it seems to apply usually, or that it often should apply. But it doesn't seem to be the same as a generality. There's something much more rigid about, it's something more a priori about a principle. Now, I would say generalities are dangerous because they can do our thinking for us and we can avoid particularity. And thus, if there's something about principles that are very pre-situation or universal, then there's probably something dangerous about them as well. Well, okay, so there seems to be a danger about generalities because it misses difference or particularity or things like that. Well, then maybe we can avoid that danger by making our generalities more open. The same would go with principles. There's something about principles that seem rigid and that seems dangerous, so could we avoid that by making principles more open? Well, it would almost seem like if you do that, you're not talking about principles anymore, right? You're just talking about assumptions or good bets or generalities. So what are we talking about? That doesn't seem to be a principle. That seems to be a rule of thumb. And maybe a principle is a rule of thumb. But again, that doesn't seem to be what people mean when they get very upset because their principles are violated, or they feel like they don't have to think about a problem because they have a principle by which to understand it. And as we go through this paper, it does seem as if principles are a way of thinking that is brought into a situation as opposed to arisen in the situation. And that would seem to be very dangerous because it would seem like principles are very blunt. They would seem to be things that are not going to be really adjusting relative to the situation. Because if you're doing that, you're just thinking. And arguably, you're not using principles. You're just actively thinking in the situation, right? So at this point, it does seem as if principles, if meaningfully distinct, is something to do with preferences. They're a reflection of an individual subjectivity who has decided that non-contingently they're going to ascribe to a certain value or interpret a situation in accordance with that principle, regardless what the situation is. Now, again, I'm not saying that whenever a person uses the term principles, they don't mean it in another way. That's perfectly fine. Again, we're just trying to isolate what this term might mean when people talk about principles, and how it might be distinct from, say, rules or mental models or guidelines. And basically what the paper is going to say is that a lot of times when people talk about principles, although they may seem kind of ethical and moral and even like character because they have their principles, often it might simply be a codified preference. Like it's something that the person prefers, and therefore they're trying to raise it to the level of being ethical and a priori, and that therefore they don't have to think about it, they just have to follow it. And in that way, principles could be a dangerous disguise for thoughtlessness, of which leads to the banality of evil, which, belonging again, we'll talk about, Hannah Arendt will talk about, and things like that. Again, if we're talking ethics and morals and mental models and guidelines, all of that is perfectly fine. But the term principle, when isolated, seems to be a problematic phenomenon. So we need to be careful whenever we talk about principles, or whenever we try to, say, resolve a conversation or in a debate or deal with a situation by referring to our principles or our principles being violated. This may be using ethics in a power move, which Nietzsche warns about. We might just be using ethics to shut down dissent and to avoid actively thinking. And we have to be very careful about that, because it would seem as if principles are very often just codified preferences that are being projected to the realm of the universal or the ethical precisely so we can get our way. But they sound stronger. The term principles sound far more powerful and authoritative than preferences, so we tend to use terms like principles to give our preferences a moral air. I'm not saying that's always the case when people talk about principles. And there's a difference between going to a conversation and ending the conversation by referring to your principles, and then principles meaning beliefs that you're willing to die for. Again, we're not going to be a stickler for the language, but we must be very, very careful that we ourselves don't refer to principles as if there's no possibility of them being codified preferences. Because if we make that mistake, we may use ethics to call something that ethics was never intended to be used for, which would be destruction, misery, and pain. For more about OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and thank you so much for your time.